The evening sky had turned a deep purple as Richard Parker guided his sleek silver Mercedes into the parking lot of the Blue Plate. The restaurant stood out among the other buildings with its warm golden lights and elegant brick exterior. Richard checked his watch, a habit he couldn't break even on the rare evenings when time didn't matter. "We're 15 minutes early, Thomas," he said, glancing in the rearview mirror at his 16-year-old son. Thomas looked up from the window and nodded. His eyes, the same deep brown as his late mother's, held a quiet excitement. These dinners with his father were rare treasures, moments when the busy millionaire property developer set aside his empire to sit across from his only child. "Do you need help with your chair?" Richard asked, already reaching for his phone to check emails while they waited. "I can manage," Thomas replied softly, his words slightly slurred but clear enough. He had learned long ago that his cerebral palsy made people uncomfortable, even his father, especially his father. Getting Thomas from car to wheelchair was a practiced routine, one that Richard performed with efficiency rather than tenderness. His movements were precise and careful, but lacking the natural warmth of a father's touch. Years of managing his son's condition had turned the process into something mechanical, another problem to solve. The restaurant host recognized Richard immediately. "Mr. Parker, we have your usual table ready." The young man's eyes darted nervously to Thomas, unsure where to look or how to address him. Richard noticed but said nothing. This was normal, people seeing the wheelchair first, his son second. Their table was in a quiet corner, partially hidden by a decorative screen that Richard had requested during his first visit years ago. It offered Thomas privacy and spared other diners from potential discomfort. At least that's how Richard had explained it to the restaurant manager. The truth was more complicated. Richard, who commanded boardrooms and closed multi-million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, felt a twist of shame when strangers stared at his son. "The specials today are excellent," the host said, handing them menus. "Your server will be with you shortly." As soon as they were alone, Richard pulled out his phone. "Just need to check on this property in Westlake," he muttered, already scrolling through emails. Thomas didn't respond. He was used to sharing his father with an endless stream of messages and calls. Instead, he focused on the menu, knowing he would order the same thing he always did: chicken tenders and fries. It was easier than trying new foods that might cause him to struggle in front of his father. The restaurant hummed with conversations and the gentle clinking of silverware against plates. Soft jazz played in the background, a piano and saxophone having a conversation of their own. Thomas found himself swaying slightly to the rhythm, his body responding to the music in a way that felt natural and free. "Do you need help cutting your food tonight?" Richard asked without looking up from his phone, his question more routine than genuine inquiry. "I'll try myself," Thomas answered, determined to show independence despite knowing how difficult it would be. When their drinks arrived, sparkling water for Richard and a Coke with a straw for Thomas, Richard was deep in conversation with someone on the phone. He raised a finger to indicate he needed a minute, and the server nodded politely before walking away. 10 minutes later, Richard was still on his call when a different server approached their table. She wasn't like the others who usually served them, young college students who averted their eyes from Thomas or spoke only to Richard. "Hi there, I'm Alicia," she said, looking directly at Thomas with a warm smile. "I'll be taking care of you both tonight." She was about 30, with deep brown skin that glowed under the restaurant lights and tight curls pulled back in a neat bun. What struck Thomas most was how she looked straight at him, not through him or around him like most people did. Richard mumbled something about needing a few more minutes while continuing his phone conversation, but Thomas was ready. "I'd like the chicken tenders, please," he said, working hard to form each word clearly. "Excellent choice," Alicia replied, writing down his order without any change in her expression or hint of discomfort at his speech. "And how about a side?" "The sweet potato fries are my personal favorite tonight." Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "I'll try those." Richard, noticing the exchange, quickly ended his call. "I'll have the steak, medium rare," he said, handing Alicia the menu without really looking at her. "Perfect," she said, collecting the menus. "Would you like to start with an appetizer?" "No," Richard began, but Thomas interrupted. "Maybe the mozzarella sticks?" he suggested, surprising his father. Alicia smiled. "Coming right up." As she walked away, Richard raised an eyebrow at his son. "You never order anything different." "Maybe it's time to try," Thomas replied quietly. Richard looked at his son as if seeing him for the first time that evening, then nodded slowly before his phone buzzed again, pulling his attention away. When Alicia returned with their appetizer, she placed it in the center of the table and then did something unexpected. She laid out the napkins and silverware, but instead of arranging Thomas's for him as servers usually did, she asked, "Would you like me to move anything so it's easier to reach?" Thomas shook his head. "I can reach everything, thank you." Richard watched the interaction while pretending to check his emails, noting how his son sat up straighter in his wheelchair. The mozzarella sticks proved challenging. Thomas struggled to grip the fork properly, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. After a few attempts, one of the sticks slid off his plate and onto the tablecloth. "I'm sorry," Thomas said immediately, his face flushing with embarrassment. Richard reached for his napkin, but Alicia was already there, cleaning up the small mess without making a fuss. "No worries at all," she said casually. "These things are slippery even for me." As she finished wiping the table, the restaurant's background music changed to a livelier jazz number. Alicia paused, her head tilting slightly as she listened. "I love this song," she said, looking at Thomas. "It's got such a good rhythm, don't you think?" Thomas nodded, his fingers tapping lightly against his wheelchair armrest. Alicia noticed. "You've got a good ear for the beat," she said. Then, with a spontaneous warmth that felt entirely natural, she added, "I'm still learning this new step for my cousin's wedding. Would you mind if I practiced it really quick? I need to make sure I've got it right." Before either Parker could respond, Alicia had stepped back slightly and held out her hands. "It starts with just swaying to the beat like this, see? Nothing fancy." Thomas watched, captivated as she demonstrated a simple side-to-side movement. "Want to try it with me?" she asked him directly, not his father. "Just your hands like this." She extended her hands, palms up, waiting. There was no pressure in her invitation, just a simple offer extended from one person to another. Thomas glanced quickly at his father, expecting the usual subtle headshake that meant, "Let's not make a scene." But Richard wasn't looking at him. He was watching Alicia with an unreadable expression. Slowly, Thomas raised his hands, which trembled slightly as they always did. Alicia gently took them in hers and began to sway them to the music's rhythm. "Perfect," she said. "Now you lead." "Me?" Thomas asked, surprised. "Absolutely. The best dancers are the ones who feel the music, not just hear it." For a moment, Thomas froze, overwhelmed by being asked to lead anything.
His whole life had been about following instructions, following routines.
Following his father's careful plans for managing his condition. But something in Alicia's expectant smile made him brave. He began to move his hands slightly, setting a gentle rhythm. "That's it," Alicia encouraged, following his lead. "You've definitely done this before?" "No," Thomas said, a small smile breaking across his face. "Never." "Could have fooled me," she replied with a wink. Richard's phone buzzed again, but for once he didn't reach for it. Instead, he watched as his son, whose movements were usually restricted and stiff, guided this kind stranger through a simple dance step with more confidence than he'd shown in years. It was only a moment, less than a minute of two hands swaying to jazz in a crowded restaurant, but Richard couldn't look away. There was something happening that he couldn't quite name, something in his son's expression he hadn't seen since before the accident that took his wife and left Thomas with permanent injuries. Joy. Simple, unguarded joy. When their main courses arrived, Alicia set down their plates and stepped back into her role as server. "Enjoy your meal, gentlemen," she said professionally, but the warm smile she gave Thomas held the shared secret of their brief dance. After she left, Thomas picked up his fork with renewed determination. His movements were still awkward, but there was a newfound patience in his attempts. "She's nice," Richard said finally, cutting into his steak. Thomas nodded. "She saw me," he said simply. Richard paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean?" "She didn't see the chair or the palsy first. She just saw me." Richard set down his fork, a strange tightness forming in his chest. When was the last time he had truly seen his son beyond the disability that had shaped both their lives? When had he stopped looking? "Thomas," he began, not sure what he wanted to say. "It's okay, Dad," Thomas replied, struggling but managing to dip a sweet potato fry in ketchup by himself. "I know you're busy." The rest of their meal passed with Richard making unusual efforts at conversation. asking Thomas about school and his physical therapy. Thomas answered carefully, unsure what to make of his father's sudden interest. When Alicia brought their check, she slipped Thomas a small paper napkin. "Here's the name of that song in case you want to practice those steps some more," she said. "You're a natural." Richard paid the bill, leaving a tip that made Alicia's eyes widen slightly. As they prepared to leave, Richard found himself saying, "We'll be back next week, same time." Thomas looked up at his father in surprise. Their dinners out were usually months apart, squeezed between Richard's business trips and meetings. "We will?" Thomas asked. Richard nodded, suddenly certain. "Yes, I think we will." As Richard helped Thomas back into the car, he noticed his son carefully folding the napkin with the song name and placing it in his pocket. Something had changed tonight, something small but significant. For the first time in years, Richard felt a flicker of curiosity about who his son might be, beyond the careful routines they had constructed around his disability. Driving away from the Blue Plate, Richard made a mental note to clear his Thursday evenings going forward. He wasn't sure exactly why, but he knew they needed to come back. Perhaps it was the way Thomas was now humming softly to himself in the back seat, his fingers still keeping time to music only he could hear. Richard Parker woke earlier than usual the next morning. The ceiling of his master bedroom came into focus as sunlight filtered through the expensive automated blinds he rarely adjusted himself. For several minutes he simply lay there, remembering the evening before, his son's face during that brief moment with the waitress. He reached for his phone out of habit, scrolling through overnight emails and messages from international partners in different time zones. Yet his mind kept drifting back to the Blue Plate, to Thomas swaying his hands to the jazz rhythm, to the natural way Alicia had spoken to his son. "She saw me." Thomas's words echoed in his head. Richard sat up and called his assistant. "Cancel my morning meetings," he said, surprising himself as much as his assistant. In 15 years, he had never spontaneously cleared his schedule. "Sir?" The confusion in her voice was evident. "You have the developer call at 9 and reschedule everything before noon. Something's come up with Thomas." The lie came easily, though Thomas was fine, probably still sleeping in his room down the hall. Richard simply needed time to think, to process what had happened last night. After a quick shower, Richard found himself doing something else unusual, walking down the hallway to his son's bedroom. He normally left the morning routine to Mrs. Chen, the live-in housekeeper who helped Thomas get ready for school. Today he knocked gently on the door. "Thomas, are you awake?" A muffled yes came from inside. Richard opened the door to find Thomas already sitting up in his specially designed bed, looking surprised to see his father. "Is everything okay, Dad?" Thomas asked, concern crossing his face. Richard realized how strange this must seem. He rarely entered his son's personal space. "Everything's fine," he said, suddenly unsure why he was there. "I just wanted to check if you enjoyed dinner last night." Thomas's eyebrows rose slightly. "I did. A lot." An awkward silence settled between them, highlighting how uncommon these personal conversations had become. "The sweet potato fries were good," Thomas added, filling the silence. Richard nodded, noticing for the first time in years how much Thomas resembled his mother. The same thoughtful eyes, the gentle way of speaking. "How had he missed this, sir?" Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway. "I was just coming to help Thomas get ready for school." "Right, of course." Richard stepped back, relieved by the interruption yet oddly disappointed. "I'll see you this evening, Thomas." Back in his home office, Richard found himself distracted during his remaining calls. By noon, he had made a decision that surprised even himself. He was going back to the Blue Plate, alone. The restaurant was different in daylight, less intimate, more businesslike as the staff prepared for lunch service. Richard felt awkward standing at the entrance, a man used to purpose and plans now waiting with neither. A young host approached. "Just one today, sir?" "Actually," Richard cleared his throat, "I'm looking for someone who works here, a server named Alicia." The host's professional smile wavered slightly. "Is there a problem I can help with?" "No problem," Richard said quickly. "I just wanted to speak with her about a special event I'm planning." It wasn't entirely untrue. Richard had been forming an idea during his drive over, though the details were still hazy even to him. "One moment, please." Richard waited, feeling increasingly out of place. What was he doing here? What would he even say to this woman? Mr. Parker? He turned to find Alicia standing there, dressed in the restaurant's uniform but without the evening's formal apron. Her hair was pulled back in the same neat bun, but in daylight he noticed the tiredness around her eyes that her warm smile couldn't quite hide. "I'm surprised to see you here," she said. "Is everything all right with your son?" The genuine concern in her voice caught him off guard. Most people asked about Thomas out of politeness or awkwardness. "Thomas is fine. Better than fine, actually. That's partly why I'm here." She waited, watching him with curious eyes. "Do you have a moment to talk?" he asked. Alicia glanced at her watch. "I have 15 minutes before my shift officially starts." They sat at a small table in the empty bar area. Now that he was here, Richard struggled to begin. "I wanted to thank you," he finally said, "for last night, for how you treated my son." Alicia's expression softened. "I didn't do anything special." "But you did," Richard insisted. "You saw him. Not his wheelchair or his disability. Just him." She considered this. "Everyone deserves to be seen," she said simply. "Especially teenagers. They get overlooked enough as it is." "You have children?" Richard asked, realizing he knew nothing about this woman. "A daughter. Lily. She's 7. A special kind of warmth entered her voice. "Smartest second grader you'll ever meet." Richard nodded, trying to imagine this woman's life outside the restaurant. "Thomas couldn't stop talking about you on the way home." "About the dance step," Alicia smiled. "He's got natural rhythm. Some people just do." There was another silence, but less awkward this time. "I don't mean to pry," Richard said carefully, "but how long have you been working here?" "Almost 3 years at the Blue Plate, but I've been waiting tables for nearly 10 years. She straightened slightly. "It's not my forever job, though. I'm in nursing school, just finished my 2nd year." Richard hadn't expected this. "Nursing? That's impressive, especially with a young daughter." "It's not easy," she admitted. "I'm here during the day, take evening classes 3 nights a week, and pick up weekend shifts at a diner closer to home when I can. My grandmother watches Lily when I'm working or in class." As she spoke, Richard began to see beyond his initial impression. This wasn't just a kind waitress who had been nice to his son. This was a woman juggling multiple responsibilities, working towards something better while caring for both her daughter and grandmother. "Why nursing?" he asked, genuinely curious. "I want to work in pediatric rehabilitation," she said, a determination entering her voice. "To help kids like your son. I've seen how the right kind of care, the right kind of attention can make all the difference." Richard felt a strange tightness in his chest. For years he had thrown money at Thomas's care. The best doctors, the best equipment, the best therapists. But had he given his son the right kind of attention? "I should get to work," Alicia said, checking her watch again. "Of course." Richard hesitated, then pulled out a business card. "I had another reason for coming here today. I wanted to... I'm not sure how to say this without it sounding strange." Alicia took the card but looked at him warily. "Thomas has physical therapy sessions 3 times a week, but they're very clinical, very focused on measurements and milestones." Richard chose his words carefully. "What you did yesterday, that simple moment of dance, I saw something in him I haven't seen in years. A connection, joy." "I'm glad," she said, still cautious. "I'd like to hire you," Richard said abruptly. "Part-time to spend time with Thomas. Not as a nurse, you're not finished with school yet, but as a companion, someone who sees him." Alicia's expression changed to surprise, then uncertainty. "Mr. Parker, you'd set your own hours around your school schedule. The pay would be significantly better than here, and you could bring your daughter if needed." The words tumbled out as Richard realized how much he wanted this to happen. Alicia stood up. "This is very unexpected. I understand. It's not a conventional job offer." "No, it's not." She slipped his card into her pocket. "I need to think about this, and I'd need to meet Thomas again in a different setting before I'd consider it." Richard hadn't expected her hesitation. "People usually jumped at his offers, that's fair," he said. "Perhaps you could come to our home this weekend? For lunch? You could bring your daughter?" Alicia considered this. "Sunday afternoon would work. We go to church in the morning, but we're free after 1. Sunday at 2 then." Richard wrote his address on a napkin, then added his personal cell number. No pressure. Just lunch and a chance to talk more. As he drove back to his office, Richard tried to make sense of what he'd just done. He'd acted on impulse, something entirely out of character, Yet it felt right, necessary even. That evening, Richard arrived home earlier than usual. He found Thomas in the family room watching a video on his tablet. "Hi, Dad," Thomas said, surprised by his father's early arrival. "Everything okay at work?" "Everything's fine." Richard sat down on the couch near Thomas's wheelchair. "I went back to the Blue Plate today." Thomas looked up, his interest immediately captured. "You did? Why?" "I spoke with Alicia. The server from last night." "You did?" Thomas repeated, a mix of confusion and curiosity in his voice. "I invited her to have lunch with us this Sunday. Her and her daughter." Richard watched his son's face carefully. "I thought maybe she could spend some time with you regularly. Not as a nurse or therapist, but just someone to talk to. Maybe teach you more dance steps." Thomas was silent for so long that Richard began to doubt his decision. "Would that be okay with you?" he finally asked. "She's coming here?" "To our house?" Thomas asked, a hint of excitement breaking through his surprise. "Yes, if you'd like that." Thomas nodded slowly, then more firmly. "I would. I really would." Later that night, Richard sat at his desk, staring at a framed photograph he usually avoided. Thomas, at age 7, before the accident, sitting on his mother's lap. They were both laughing at something off camera, a moment of pure happiness frozen in time. Richard touched the glass gently. "I'm trying, Clara," he whispered to his late wife's image. "I don't know if it's the right thing, but I'm trying." His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mr. Parker, this is Alicia from the Blue Plate. We'll see you Sunday at 2. Lily is excited to meet Thomas. Thank you for the invitation." Richard read the message twice, feeling a strange mix of anxiety and hope. After years of rigid routines and emotional distance, he had set something in motion that he couldn't fully control. For a man who planned everything, it was terrifying. It was also, he realized, the first truly parental decision he'd made in years, not as Thomas's caretaker or provider, but as his father. Sunday arrived with a nervousness Richard hadn't felt in years. He found himself checking the house repeatedly, making sure everything was perfect for their guests. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, watched with quiet amusement as her normally distant employer suddenly fussed over flower arrangements and cushion placements. "The patio might be better for lunch," Richard said, pacing the large living room, more casual. "Thomas is comfortable out there, right?" "Yes, sir," Mrs. Chen replied. "I've already set up the table as you asked. Thomas is getting ready now." Richard nodded, checking his watch. It was only 12:30. "Is the food the caterer will deliver at 1:30, sir?" "Everything is arranged." Richard stopped pacing and took a deep breath. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. I'm being ridiculous, aren't I?" The housekeeper's eyes crinkled with a suppressed smile. "It's nice to see you excited about something besides work. Mr. Parker." At 1:55, Thomas wheeled himself onto the patio, wearing a new blue shirt Richard hadn't seen before. "You look nice," Richard said. Thomas shrugged, but Richard caught the small smile his son tried to hide. "It's just lunch, Dad." The doorbell rang at exactly 2. Richard found himself straightening his casual sweater before opening the front door. Alicia stood there in a simple yellow sundress, looking different outside her waitress uniform. Beside her was a small girl with the same warm brown eyes, wearing a white dress with tiny flowers embroidered on the collar. "Hello, Mr. Parker," Alicia said, her voice carrying the same quiet confidence it had at the restaurant. "Please, call me Richard," he replied, stepping back to welcome them in. "And you must be Lily." The little girl nodded solemnly, staying close to her mother's side. "Thank you for inviting us," Alicia said, handing him a small cake container. "We brought dessert. Lily helped make it. I stirred the batter," the child added, her voice small but proud. "Well, I can't wait to try it," Richard said, accepting the container. "Thomas is waiting on the patio. He's been looking forward to seeing you again." As they walked through the large house, Richard saw it through their eyes. The high ceilings, expensive art, and perfect furniture that had always felt more like a showroom than a home. Lily's eyes widened as they passed the grand piano that no one ever played. "Do you have a swimming pool?" she whispered to Richard. "We do," he said, smiling at her directness. "Maybe another time we can have a pool day." The moment they stepped onto the patio, Richard saw Thomas sit up straighter in his wheelchair. His son's eyes brightened in a way that made Richard's chest tighten with a mix of joy and regret. "Hi, Thomas," Alicia said warmly. "This is my daughter, Lily. Thomas smiled. Hi, Lily, I like your dress. The little girl studied Thomas with the unfiltered curiosity of childhood. My grandma made it. Why's your chair so big? Lily, Alicia began, but Thomas laughed. It's okay, he said. It's big because it has to hold all of me, plus these wheels so I can move around without walking. Lily considered this. Does it go fast? Not as fast as I'd like, Thomas admitted, but faster than my dad walks. Richard found himself smiling at his son's unexpected joke. When had Thomas developed this sense of humor? Had it always been there, hidden behind the awkward silences that usually filled their conversations? Lunch went better than Richard could have hoped. The tension he'd feared never materialized. Instead, there was an easy flow of conversation, guided mostly by Lily's endless questions and Thomas's patient answers. Alicia watched her daughter carefully but didn't shut down her natural curiosity, something Richard appreciated. When the meal was finished, Mrs. Chen brought out Lily's cake along with coffee for the adults and milk for the children. Before dessert, Richard said, setting down his napkin, I thought maybe we could talk about what I mentioned the other day. Alicia nodded, her expression growing more serious. You said something about hiring me to spend time with Thomas? Yes, Richard replied, suddenly feeling the weight of Thomas and Lily listening intently. But perhaps we should discuss the details privately. I'd like to hear too, Thomas said quietly. Since it's about me. Richard hesitated, then nodded. His son deserved to be part of this conversation. What I'm proposing, Richard began, is a part-time position that would work around your school schedule, Alicia. You'd spend time with Thomas 3 or 4 afternoons a week. Maybe help with his homework, take him to appointments if needed, and, he looked at his son, maybe introduce more music and movement into his routine. Like dancing? Lily asked eagerly. Something like that. Richard smiled at her. Thomas seems to have a natural feel for rhythm that none of his physical therapists have ever tapped into. That's because they're too busy measuring angles and muscle strength, Thomas said with surprising frankness. They don't care if I enjoy the exercises. Alicia looked thoughtfully at Thomas. Movement therapy through music can be very effective. We've studied some programs in my pediatric courses. The position would include full health benefits, Richard continued, and a salary that should allow you to reduce your restaurant hours, maybe even quit if you wanted to focus more on your studies. Alicia's eyes widened slightly, and Richard could see her calculating what this would mean for her family. That's very generous, she said slowly, but I have concerns, such as, Richard prompted, for one, my grandmother. She's getting older and needs someone around more often. I can't leave her alone all day. Richard had anticipated this. We could arrange for a home health aide to visit your grandmother while you're here. At my expense, of course. Alicia's expression changed to one of surprise, then wariness. That's extremely generous. Almost too generous, Mr. Parker. Which leads to my second concern. She glanced meaningfully at the children, and Richard understood. Thomas, he said, why don't you show Lily the fish pond? You can take your cake with you. Thomas looked between the adults, understanding something important was happening. Sure. Come on, Lily, we have koi fish bigger than your hand. The little girl followed eagerly, walking beside Thomas's wheelchair as they moved to the far end of the large patio, where a small decorative pond bubbled peacefully. When they were out of earshot, Alicia leaned forward. Mr. Parker, Richard, please. Richard, she corrected, I need to be very clear about something. I'm not looking for a personal arrangement of any kind. If that's what this offer is about, it's not, Richard interrupted, feeling his face grow warm. Not at all. This is about Thomas. Only Thomas. Alicia studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. I've had wealthy men make job offers before. They rarely turn out to be just about the job. Richard felt a flash of embarrassment, both for himself and for his gender. I understand your concern. It's a reasonable one, but I promise you my only interest is my son's well-being. He looked over at Thomas, who was showing Lily how to feed the fish. When I saw him with you at the restaurant, I realized how much he's missing. Not just physically, but connections, joy, normal teenage experiences. Alicia followed his gaze. He seems like a wonderful young man. He is, Richard said softly. And I've been too busy building my business to notice him growing up. His mother died when he was 8, the same accident that caused his cerebral palsy. I'm sorry, Alicia said, genuine compassion in her voice. That must have been devastating for both of you. Richard nodded, surprising himself by continuing. After we lost Clara, I threw myself into work, into making money. I told myself it was for Thomas to make sure he always had the best care. But honestly, I think it was easier than facing our new reality. Grief makes us do strange things, Alicia said. She was quiet for a moment before adding, Lily's father left when I told him I was pregnant, just walked away and never looked back. Richard felt a surge of anger toward a man he'd never met. His loss? Yes, it is, Alicia agreed, a small smile lifting the corner of her mouth. But it meant I had to put my dreams on hold. I was halfway through pre-med when I found out about Lily. And now you're back in school, Richard observed. That takes courage. It takes money mostly, Alicia laughed softly. And time, which is even harder to come by. Richard watched the children by the pond, seeing how naturally Thomas interacted with Lily, how patient he was with her endless questions. His son had grown into someone Richard barely knew. Let me help you finish school, he said suddenly, regardless of whether you take the job with Thomas. I'll cover your tuition and expenses for the rest of your nursing program. Alicia stared at him, clearly stunned. Why would you do that? Because people should be able to follow their dreams, Richard said simply. Especially dreams that will help others. She shook her head in disbelief. You barely know me. I know enough, Richard replied. I know you're kind. I know you see people for who they really are. I know you're working incredibly hard to build a better future for yourself and your daughter. Alicia looked down at her hands, clearly overwhelmed. This doesn't make sense. Not everything has to make business sense to be right, Richard said, surprising himself with the words. When Alicia looked up again, her eyes were shining with unshed tears. I'll accept the job with Thomas, she said quietly. But the tuition, that's too much. I can't think about it, Richard interrupted gently. No strings attached, I promise. Just consider it an investment in a future nurse who's going to change lives. The children's laughter drifted across the patio as Lily squealed in delight at something Thomas had shown her. 2 weeks, Richard added. Try working with Thomas for 2 weeks, see if it's a good fit for both of you. If it is, we'll discuss a more permanent arrangement. Alicia took a deep breath, then nodded. 2 weeks? I can do that. When can you start? I have classes Monday and Wednesday afternoons. I could come Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday after Thomas gets home from school. Richard smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Perfect. Mrs. Chen can show you around the house tomorrow, and you can start Tuesday. As they rejoined the children, Richard noticed how Thomas's eyes followed Alicia, not with the awkward crush of a teenage boy, but with something like hope. For the first time in years, Richard felt he might have done something truly right as a father. Later, after their guests had gone, Thomas sat quietly in the family room, a thoughtful expression on his face. What did you think of Lily? Richard asked, sitting down across from his son. She's funny, Thomas said. Smart, too. She knew all the fish names after I told her just once. Richard nodded. And Alicia? Thomas was quiet for a moment. She's different from my other therapists and tutors. How so? She doesn't look at me like I'm a project or a problem, Thomas said simply. She just talks to me like I'm me. Richard felt those words like a gentle accusation. How long had it been since he'd truly seen his son as just Thomas? Not a medical condition to manage. She's going to start coming over this week, Richard said. Just to spend time with you, help with homework, maybe try some movement exercises with music? Thomas nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I'd like that. As Richard watched his son wheel himself toward his bedroom, he wondered what Clara would think of all this. Would she approve of this impulsive decision? Of inviting strangers into their carefully ordered lives? Somehow he knew she would. Clara had always understood what Thomas needed far better than he ever had. 6 months passed, bringing autumn leaves that drifted across the Parker Estate's manicured lawn. The grand house that had once felt like a museum now echoed with music and occasional laughter. The change had come gradually, so subtle that Richard barely noticed it happening until it had already transformed their lives. It began with small things. Alicia rearranging Thomas's therapy room to create more open space. New speakers installed so music could fill the room. A playlist Thomas had created himself, full of songs with strong, steady rhythms. Richard found himself coming home earlier these days, making excuses to leave meetings that once would have kept him at the office until midnight. The first time had been accidental, a canceled conference call giving him a rare free afternoon. He had arrived to find his usually quiet house filled with jazz music, and the sight that greeted him in Thomas's therapy room had stopped him in his tracks. Thomas was standing, not just standing passively, supported by the parallel bars his physical therapist had installed years ago, but actively moving. Alicia stood nearby, not touching him but present, her hands occasionally gesturing encouragement. Thomas's movements were small and clearly difficult, a gentle sway from one foot to the other, but the concentration and determination on his face made Richard's throat tighten. "That's it," Alicia was saying. "Feel the beat. It's not about getting it perfect. It's about finding your own rhythm." Richard had stood in the doorway unnoticed, watching his son doing something the specialist had deemed unlikely, finding his own way to move with purpose and joy. Now, 6 months later, these sessions had become the center of Thomas's week. Richard checked his watch as he pulled into the driveway, noting that he was home even earlier than usual. Today marked a milestone. Thomas had been practicing a specific movement sequence for weeks, determined to show his father the entire routine without stopping. As Richard entered the house, the familiar sound of music greeted him, but there was something different today, a new song, something with a stronger beat than the jazz Thomas usually preferred. He followed the sound to the therapy room but stopped in the doorway, stunned by the scene before him. The parallel bars had been pushed to the sides of the room. In the cleared space, Thomas stood with the support of just one bar, his other hand stretched out toward Alicia, who mirrored his position. Between them, little Lily was showing Thomas a twirling move, her white dress flaring out as she spun. "Now you try," the 7-year-old commanded, and to Richard's amazement, Thomas carefully shifted his weight and made a small turning motion. "Perfect." Lily clapped her hands in delight. "You're getting really good, Thomas." Richard must have made some small sound because all three turned toward him. Thomas's face lit up in a way that made him look younger, more carefree. "Dad, you're early." "The Anderson meeting wrapped up sooner than expected," Richard explained, entering the room. "What's this new routine?" "Lily's been teaching me ballet," Thomas said with a grin. "Did you know she takes lessons?" "Every Saturday morning," Lily announced proudly. "Miss Alicia takes me." Richard looked at Alicia, who shrugged with a small smile. "She's been dying to show Thomas what she's learning. They've been working on this all week." "Well, don't stop on my account," Richard said, setting his briefcase down and loosening his tie. "I'd love to see it." Thomas hesitated, a flash of his old self-consciousness crossing his face. "It's not perfect yet." "That's okay," Richard said. "I'm just happy to see you enjoying yourself." Something in his tone must have convinced Thomas because he nodded and turned back to his position. Alicia restarted the music, and Richard watched as his son moved carefully through a sequence of small steps and turns. They were limited by his mobility, but there was an undeniable grace to how Thomas had adapted the movements to work with his body rather than fighting against its limitations. When they finished, Richard found himself applauding spontaneously. "That was wonderful." "Thomas is going to be in my recital," Lily announced matter-of-factly. "I am?" Thomas looked surprised. "You are?" Alicia echoed, equally caught off guard. "Miss Beverly said we could invite someone for the friend dance part," Lily explained as if it were obvious. "I want Thomas to be my special guest." Richard watched his son's face carefully, expecting to see panic at the idea of performing in public. Instead, Thomas looked thoughtful. "Would I have to go on stage?" he asked. "Just for one song," Lily said. "And I'll be right there with you." Thomas looked at Alicia. "Could we make it work?" "If you want to do it, we'll find a way," she said, her voice holding the same steady confidence that had first drawn Richard's attention months ago. "We have 6 weeks to practice." "Then yes," Thomas said, a new determination in his voice. "I'll do it." Later that evening, after Alicia and Lily had gone home, Richard sat with Thomas in the family room. Something had been on his mind for weeks, and tonight felt like the right time to bring it up. "I've been thinking," he began, "about starting a foundation." Thomas looked up from his tablet. "What kind of foundation?" "Something focused on accessible arts programs for kids with physical disabilities," Richard explained. "Music, dance, theater, creative outlets that traditional therapy doesn't usually address. Thomas set his tablet down, giving his father his full attention. Because of what Alicia's been doing with me? Richard nodded. I've been watching how much progress you've made, not just physically, but in your confidence. And I keep thinking about how many other kids could benefit from programs like this. That's actually really cool, Dad, Thomas said, genuine enthusiasm in his voice. Would it be like a charity? More than that, Richard said, warming to the topic. I'm thinking of a full center, somewhere with adaptive equipment, specialized instructors, maybe even performance spaces designed to be fully accessible. You're serious about this, Thomas observed. I am, Richard confirmed, but I'd want you to be involved, maybe even as the inspiration behind it. Thomas was quiet for a moment, and Richard worried he had overstepped. His son had never enjoyed being the center of attention. I'd like that, Thomas finally said, but I'd want Alicia involved too. She's the one who figured out how to make the movement work with music. I was hoping she would be. Richard admitted. I think she could help design some of the programs, especially once she finishes her nursing degree. They fell into a comfortable silence, so different from the awkward pauses that had once filled their conversations. Dad, Thomas said after a while, have you noticed your phone hasn't buzzed once tonight? Richard blinked in surprise, realizing Thomas was right. I put it on silent during dinner. Thomas shook his head. No, I mean you haven't even looked at it. You used to check it every few minutes, even at home. Richard hadn't consciously made this change, but his son was right. Somewhere along the way, his priorities had shifted without him even noticing. I guess I found something more interesting to pay attention to, he said with a small smile. 3 weeks later, Richard sat in a crowded auditorium, watching as Lily's dance class performed their recital. He had attended enough of these events in the past months to recognize most of the children on stage. Lily had practically become a fixture in their home, coming with her mother most afternoons and often staying for dinner. When the announcer called for the special friendship dance, Richard held his breath as Thomas wheeled himself onto the stage. They had practiced for weeks, adapting the routine so Thomas could participate both in his chair and, for brief moments, standing with support. Alicia had worked with the dance teacher to make sure everything was safe, while still giving Thomas the full experience. The music began, a slow, gentle melody that gradually built in tempo. Lily danced around Thomas's wheelchair with graceful movements that belied her 7 years. Then came the moment they had rehearsed so carefully. Thomas locked his wheelchair and, using the specially designed portable support bar they had brought, slowly rose to a standing position. A murmur rippled through the audience. Richard felt his eyes burning as Thomas and Lily performed the simple but beautiful sequence of movements they had practiced. It wasn't technically perfect. Thomas's balance wavered once, but the joy on their faces made it one of the most moving performances of the evening. When it ended, the audience erupted in applause. Richard found himself on his feet, clapping until his hands hurt, not caring about the tears that slid down his cheeks. Afterwards, in the lobby, Richard stood with Alicia as they watched Thomas and Lily accept congratulations from other families. I never thought I'd see him like this, Richard said quietly. So confident, so happy. Alicia smiled, her eyes also fixed on the children. He always had it in him. He just needed someone to see it. Someone like you, Richard said. I can never thank you enough for what you've done for him. For us. I didn't do it alone, Alicia replied. You changed too, Richard. You started seeing him differently. Richard nodded, knowing she was right. He had stopped seeing Thomas's disability as the defining feature of his son, and started seeing the young man behind it, thoughtful, determined, and far more capable than anyone had given him credit for. The foundation paperwork went through, he said. Changing the subject slightly, we're officially established. The Accessible Arts Initiative. That was fast, Alicia remarked. When you have good lawyers and are willing to write big checks, things tend to move quickly, Richard said with a small smile. I've already started looking at properties for our first center. Our? Alicia raised an eyebrow. I was hoping you might consider taking a more formal role, Richard said. Once you graduate in May, we'll need someone who understands both the therapeutic and creative aspects. Alicia looked surprised, then thoughtful. I'd have to think about it. Make sure it aligns with my career goals. Of course, Richard nodded. No pressure, just consider it. They were interrupted by Lily running up, still in her recital costume. "Did you see us? Did you see when Thomas did the turn all by himself?" "We saw everything," Alicia assured her daughter. "You were both amazing." Thomas joined them, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. I can't even describe it," he said. "When everyone stood up at the end, they were standing for you," Richard said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Because you did something extraordinary." Thomas smiled up at him, and in that moment Richard saw not just his son, but his future, a future far different from the limited one he had once imagined for Thomas. A future full of possibilities, connection, and joy. Later that night, as Richard passed Thomas's room, he heard his son's voice on the phone. "And then Dad said they're actually going to build a whole center based on what we've been doing." Richard paused, not wanting to eavesdrop but touched by the pride in his son's voice. He had spent years building an empire of buildings and businesses, but nothing had ever felt as meaningful as the foundation taking shape now. A foundation built not on property values, but on his son's courage and a waitress's simple act of kindness. 3 years had passed since that first dinner at the Blue Plate. The restaurant itself had changed little. Same golden lights, same jazz music, same quiet corner table where it had all begun. But tonight the entire place had been transformed for a special event. "Ladies and gentlemen," the restaurant manager announced, tapping a spoon against his glass, "welcome to the 3rd annual gala for the Accessible Arts Foundation." Applause filled the room as Richard Parker stood to address the crowd. At 45, he looked different than he had 3 years ago. Less rigid, more at ease in his own skin. His suit was still impeccably tailored, but his smile came more naturally now. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, surveying the room filled with donors, program participants and their families. 3 years ago, in this very restaurant, I witnessed something that changed my life and my son's life forever. His eyes found Thomas, now 19, sitting at a table near the small stage that had been set up for the evening. Thomas no longer used his wheelchair full-time, though it remained nearby for when fatigue set in. Instead, he sat in a regular chair, a pair of sleek carbon fiber crutches leaning against the wall behind him. "A simple act of kindness," Richard continued, "showed me possibilities I had never imagined for my son. It taught me that disability doesn't define ability, and that sometimes the most powerful therapy doesn't come from a medical textbook." At Thomas's table sat Alicia, elegant in a simple blue dress, her nursing school pin proudly displayed on her collar. Beside her was Lily, now 10 years old and growing tall, her feet swinging slightly beneath the table as she listened to Richard's speech. In 3 short years, the Accessible Arts Foundation has opened 2 centers serving over 300 young people with physical disabilities. We've developed programs in adaptive dance, music, theater, and visual arts. We've seen children who were told they would never perform on stage. We've watched teenagers find their voices through music when speech therapists had given up. Richard gestured toward a display of photographs. Along one wall, smiling children in dance studios with adaptive equipment, teenagers playing modified instruments, young adults creating art with specialized tools. None of this would have been possible without the vision and expertise of our program director, who just completed her master's degree in therapeutic recreation while running our flagship center. Richard smiled at Alicia, or without our youth ambassador, who continues to inspire everyone with his determination and talent. Thomas straightened in his chair, his face flushing slightly at the attention, but his eyes bright with confidence that would have been unimaginable 3 years ago. "Tonight," Richard continued, "we're announcing the construction of our 3rd center, which will focus specifically on transitional programs for young adults aging out of pediatric services. And to demonstrate what's possible when we rethink our approach to ability, I'd like to invite my son Thomas and our program director Alicia to the floor." The crowd applauded as Thomas rose carefully from his chair. Using his crutches with practiced ease, he made his way to the small clearing in the center of the restaurant. Alicia joined him, standing close but not touching him, present but allowing him his independence. The jazz quartet in the corner began to play a slow, rhythmic piece. Thomas handed his crutches to Richard and took position, one hand on the portable support bar that had been set up for him. As the music built, Thomas and Alicia began to move in a choreographed dance they had spent months perfecting. Richard watched with pride as his son, whose doctors had once doubted would walk independently again, performed movements that showcased not just his physical progress but the confidence and joy he had found through movement. The audience watched in respectful silence, many with tears in their eyes. When the dance ended, everyone rose for a standing ovation. Richard handed Thomas his crutches and embraced his son, no longer awkward in showing affection. Later, as guests mingled and discussed donation pledges, a reporter from the local newspaper approached Richard. "Mr. Parker," she said, "your foundation has gained national attention for its innovative approach. What would you say is the secret to your success?" Richard considered the question, watching as across the room, Alicia demonstrated an adaptive dance technique to a young girl who had arrived in a wheelchair similar to the one Thomas had once used full-time. "The secret?" he repeated thoughtfully. "I think it's seeing potential rather than limitations. For too long, we've focused on what people with disabilities can't do instead of finding new ways for them to do what they love." "And was that your vision from the beginning?" the reporter asked. Richard smiled, remembering that first moment when a waitress had asked his withdrawn son to dance. "No, it wasn't my vision at all. I learned it from watching someone who instinctively knew how to connect with my son when I had forgotten how." The reporter followed his gaze to where Alicia was now helping the young girl rise from her wheelchair to try a simple movement. "Your foundation's director?" "Yes," Richard said. "Before she was our director, before she finished her nursing degree or her master's program, she was a waitress here who took a moment to see my son as a person, not a disability. That moment changed everything." After the reporter moved on, Richard found himself standing beside Thomas at the donation table. "Quite a night," he said to his son. "How are you holding up? Need to sit down?" Thomas shook his head. "I'm good. Dr. Chen says my stamina has improved 30% since last year." Richard nodded, still amazed by his son's progress. The physical changes were remarkable, but even more impressive was the confident young man Thomas had become. A student now at the local community college, studying recreational therapy with plans to work at the foundation full-time after graduation. "Dad," Thomas said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I've been wanting to ask you something." "What is it?" "Do you ever miss it?" "The business? The deals?" Thomas gestured vaguely toward the world outside. "You used to run one of the biggest development companies in the state. Now you spend most of your time on the foundation." Richard considered the question carefully. 3 years ago, he had begun stepping back from day-to-day operations of Parker Developments, bringing in a CEO to manage things while he focused on the foundation. His business still thrived, but it no longer consumed him. "I thought I would miss it more," he admitted. "But the truth is, I've never felt more fulfilled than I do now. Seeing what we're building with the foundation, it matters in a way that office towers never did." Thomas nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. "Alicia says the same thing. She could be making twice as much at the hospital with her credentials, but she says nothing compares to what we're doing here." Richard's eyes found Alicia again, now chatting with donors across the room. Over the past 3 years, she had become not just an employee, but a trusted friend and partner in building the foundation. Her insight, compassion, and practical approach had shaped every aspect of their programs. "She's remarkable," Richard said simply. "She is." Thomas agreed with a knowing smile. "You know, Dad, it's okay if you want to ask her out sometime. For real, I mean, not just to foundation events." Richard felt his face grow warm. "Is it that obvious?" "To everyone except maybe you and Alicia," Thomas laughed. "Lily's been trying to make it happen for at least a year. She told me she wants you to be her new dad." "She said that?" Richard asked, surprised. "Kids her age don't filter much," Thomas replied with a shrug. "But yeah, she talks about our family all the time. Like it's already a thing." Richard had never considered himself a shy man, but the idea of changing his relationship with Alicia made him uncharacteristically nervous. Their professional partnership worked so well, and he worried about complicating it. Yet he couldn't deny that his feelings had grown beyond friendship and respect. "Maybe I will," he said finally. "But tonight is about the foundation, not my personal life." As the evening wound down, guests began to depart, leaving just the core team behind. Lily had fallen asleep in a corner booth, curled up with the tablet Thomas had given her for her birthday. "I should get her home," Alicia said, gathering her things. "It's been a long night for a 10-year-old. "Let me call my driver for you," Richard offered. It's too late for you to be waiting for a ride share. Actually, Thomas interrupted, I wanted to show Lily something on the new software we got for the center. When she wakes up, maybe you two could get coffee while you wait. The cafe down the street is still open. Richard and Alicia exchanged a glance, both recognizing Thomas's not-so-subtle matchmaking. Subtle, Thomas, Alicia said with a laugh. Really subtle, Thomas grinned, unrepentant. I learned from the best. You're the one who told me direct communication is important. Coffee does sound good, Richard admitted, if you're interested. Alicia looked at him for a long moment, then smiled. I am. Very interested. As they walked together toward the door, Richard glanced back at his son, who gave him an encouraging thumbs up. 3 years ago, he couldn't have imagined this scene. His son confident and thriving, himself actually nervous about a coffee date. Their lives intertwined with Alicia and Lily in ways that felt both unexpected and absolutely right. Outside, the night was clear and cool, stars visible despite the city lights. As they walked toward the cafe, Richard found himself thinking about how paths cross in life, how one small moment, one decision to truly see another person, can ripple outward in ways no one could predict. What are you thinking about? Alicia asked, noticing his contemplative expression. Full circles, Richard replied. How we've ended up back at the Blue Plate, but everything is different now. Not everything, Alicia said softly. Some things have been the same all along. Like what? She smiled, her eyes reflecting the streetlights. Like how we both saw something special in Thomas, even if we saw it in different ways. Like how some connections just make sense from the very beginning. Richard nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. As they reached the cafe, he held the door open for her, stepping into this new chapter with the same sense of hope he'd felt watching his son dance for the first time. Behind them, the Blue Plate's golden lights continued to shine, a reminder that sometimes the most important journeys begin in the most ordinary places, with a simple act of kindness, with truly seeing another person, with the courage to lead with your heart.